65. Cream and pudding and cake that's not a lie. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking at dessert in the 18th century, especially the flourishing of cream and puddings and cakes and the emergence of ice as a player in the fanciest foods of the powerful. There's mostly not ice cream in the colonies yet, but we will spend time looking at all the things that aren't ice cream, but just barely. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the 18th century is the hardest working cake century in American food history. It's the only century there really was wheat and eggs and sugar cakes, but no whisks or beaters. So if you wanted cake, you had to work for it. This is the century that witnesses the birth of the pound cake. So you can imagine that stirring a pound of butter with a wooden spoon in a chilly kitchen until it is soft as cream, and then beating in a pound of sugar, flour, and around 12 eggs, this would be about a good hour of mixing work. Oof, by hand. Just for dessert. You can understand why truly accomplished cooks must have had forearms modern UFC fighters would respect. So here we are in the 18th century. People have figured out how to grow wheat. There are mills. There's an improved food transport system. There are chickens for eggs. There are cows for butter. And the sugar exploitation system has been optimized for both maximum output and, frankly, maximum callous cruelty. So some sugar and definitely molasses were within reach of a large portion of the population, especially as a treat for Christmas or weddings or other celebrations of note. It is worth pointing out that cakes of this time were made with entirely shelf-stable ingredients. Sugar and flour, of course, in dry, tight containers could last a year or longer. But even butter, if properly washed and salted and kept in a cellar or ice house, could last months. And stored correctly, eggs can be made to last for weeks, easily, and with a little more effort, can last for months. Common add-ins at this time were seeds. Caraway was the most popular. Poppy seeds, like vanilla, were in the future for North America, though they were plenty popular at this time in Persian, Arab, and Central European cuisine. Records of their cultivation have been found as far back as the 1st century CE in Sumeria, or the Fertile Crescent, but we'll have to wait until the 20th century to find poppy seeds as the seed in an American seed cake. Along with seeds, dried fruits, raisins, currants, plums, prunes were common, as were candied citrus peel in especially fancy cakes. Mostly citron peel, but sometimes lemon or orange, and if you were feeling expansive, maybe some candied angelica stems or roots. That's a celery relative with a light licorice flavor if you don't have that in your spice rotation. And there were spice cakes which incorporated cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, and this newfangled thing, allspice. Nuts might be incorporated as well. Almonds were typically pounded fine to add texture and flavor, but no nut crunch. Walnuts were also commonly included, and sometimes this new American nut, the pecan, the pecan, I'm not going to get into that one, might appear, but probably only if you knew people in New Orleans. Shh, you know they're French, right? We mostly don't like the French right now. So, cakes. While based on flour, sugar, butter, and egg combinations, they varied greatly in richness and lightness based on all sorts of variables. First, how fine was your flour? Was it all wheat, or did it have some rye or corn mixed in? These, of course, would create a denser texture, possibly grainy in the case of cornmeal. But if you did go for an all-wheat flour cake, how well was it bolted or sifted? Were you able to afford the kind with all the bran removed? And if you did have a fine cake flour, did you remember to dry it in front of a cooling oven or hearth to make it as fine and light as possible? This was also a good way to make sure there were no, beetles. When it came to sweeteners for your cake, was this a weekday family cake or one for the help? In that case, molasses or maple syrup was just fine. This would also give the cake a stickier and denser texture, but for this sort of cake, one need not go to so much trouble. The tan or brown color of the cake wouldn't matter. If you were going to mix anything in to make this cake a bit richer, only dried fruit goes here. The candied fruit and expensive spices need not be considered. But if the cake was for company or a big celebration, it's time to pull out a white sugar loaf. To get the lightest and most tender cake, you'll have to snip off lumps of sugar from the cone in the amount you need. Then pound the sugar to crystals, and then for the finest cakes, to a powder. Even if your cake had a brown or golden cast from the less refined sugar, your cake would still be greatly improved by pounding the crystals fine. Your butter should be the sweetest you have, and unless it is the height of cream season, it will have a little tang. All the same, it's important that you thoroughly wash your butter. The last wash should be in spring water, and when your butter is quite spread out and soft. That will guarantee the most salt is rinsed from it. Because eggs in the 18th century were a non-standard size, there was always some guesswork here. But generally the eggs were smaller than our modern large and extra large eggs, unless you're working with duck eggs. It took a cook's experience to know the eggs she tended to have and how they translated to the recipe she had on hand or in her head. Quick egg sidebar here. The regular egg of today is a large egg, each one weighing in at about 2 ounces or 57 grams, but the typical colonial egg was more likely small, so around 1.5 ounces or 42 grams, or even peewee, 1.25 ounces or 35 grams, which means the recipe asking for 12 eggs would only need 8 or 9 today, which, okay, is still a pretty big cake. But if you were making a cake with all that pricey sugar, make lots of cake. At this point, there's no frosting. Fats other than butter are too, flavorful to be considered for a cake topping. Cream was whipped with a bunch of twigs, so making whipped cream frosting was beyond all but the burliest cook with the most helpers. Carefully formed puffs of cream to decorate and highlight cakes might happen, but realistically, the skilled cook who is able to wrangle a wood-heated oven in such a way as to get an even baking on a cake wanted you, the eater, to see the beautiful, even color of the cake. The lack of scorch marks was a point of pride. Smooth sides and fine edges were shown off. Naked cakes weren't a trend, they were everything. A sauce of wine and sugar and maybe lemon or orange juice were the way to add flavor and show off just a little more of the richness in the pantry. In the very fanciest houses with the few recently imported professional French cooks, there might occasionally be pulled sugar nests or candy-coated nuts or flowers or seeds, comfits or wafers to add extra flair, greenery, fresh flowers and herbs which allowed one to produce a bountiful scene and show off an eye for arrangement were the perfect accompaniment. Though as transatlantic and now trans-Pacific trade was picking up, a porcelain dish from Cathay or the new potteries in Chelsea or Worcester were also ways to show off your good taste. Now, if it was an event where you were serving cake, you were never going to serve just a cake. It must be accompanied. Puddings, of course, were familiar foods. We've talked about them in terms of being a sausage precursor, aka haggis and friends, and things like chicken pudding, marrow pudding, or cabbage pudding. But the 18th century, and particularly in the colonies, pudding became lots of sweetened, smooth, baked things. Indian pudding, carrot pudding, pumpkin pudding, potato pudding, rice pudding, almond pudding, citron pudding, stuff like that. In the 17th century colonies, puddings were just as varied and savory leaning as they were in England. But as the sugar availability and meat availability of Britain and the colonies diverged, so did ideas about what puddings were. Because more colonists had more access to muscle meats, rather than lots of heads and tripes and shins. The need to get creative with savory puddings waned, and the greater access to sugar meant that sweet puddings were appearing on more tables more of the time. So in the colonies, puddings meant sweet more and more of the time. Sure, the recipe for black pudding hung on, but that's mainly because no one wanted to say blood sausage. But the shift had started. And with their newfound wheat and dairy riches, it wasn't just cakes that people were making. Puddings were getting crusts as well. At the start of the 18th century, sweet puddings usually contained milk and cream and eggs. Then sweet or savory often had grated breadcrumbs, or in the colonies, cornmeal. It was added to act as a thickener and a stabilizer. Sweet puddings might have a crust at the bottom, but often only called for a well-buttered dish. By the middle of the century, if at all possible, all puddings were expected to have a bottom crust. They weren't as sweet as tarts, which had more sugar and never had a top crust. That was reserved for pies. And the pudding fillings had gotten exotic with the discovery of New World fruits and vegetables, squash and pumpkin pudding, potato puddings, and then sweet potato puddings. These tended to be a specialty of South Carolina and that trusteeship of Georgia. Virginia was the far north point of the sweet potato range. To make the potato and sweet potato landscape more interesting, the original thing called potato in Royal English cookery were sweet potatoes. That's what the Spanish brought back first and spread about with the drinking chocolate. They were sweet and were appreciated and even prized in a land of fantastically expensive sugar. And in the 16th century world, where sugar was still fabulously expensive, this sweet imported tuber that shipped and stored far better than any fruit, it was practically magical. So the earliest potato pudding recipes are for sweet potatoes. By the end of the 17th century, there were white potatoes in Europe, which are an entirely different species from sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are relatives of morning glories. Their leaves are edible and show up in East Asian and East and West African dishes. You can sometimes find their close relative in U.S. Asian groceries as water spinach, hollow vegetable, or yam leaf. On the other hand, what are generally known as white potatoes, which of course come in other colors, are members of the nightshade family, cousins of tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, and so on. Their leaves are poisonous enough to make some people ill. So mainstream American cuisine, out of confusion and an overabundance of caution, has tended to entirely avoid potato leaves of any kind at all times. And to make things even more topsy-turvy, sweet potatoes were first called yams in the colonies, as they do resemble, in miniature, the true yams of Africa that the West Africans frequently ate back in their own farms when they had been at home. There are simply no American yams, but some African yams are now grown in the Caribbean. So now that I've cleared that up, back to puddings. As the population became more affluent, selling cod or boats or naval stores of pitch from longleaf pines or indigo or rice or fancy plants for the fashionable new ornamental gardens, things like magnolias or smoke trees or azaleas, the puddings, instead of being just comfortable dishes to creatively use interesting animal parts or make something with leftover bread, they, like so much other food, became a way to show some power. The puddings of the rich and powerful, with professional or enslaved cooks, started to lean towards becoming mainly expensively flavored custard bases, a cooked combination of just sugar and cream and eggs, and often just the egg yolks, the fatty part, you know. These would be spiked with orange or orange water, lemon, almond, rose water, and musk or ambergris. Because at this time, almost anyone could make a pumpkin or a yam pudding. Just keep stewing that over a fire and it will thicken up nicely, hold its shape, and never curdle. And it's not that hard to grow a pumpkin. Even now, September and October are a hilarious time on farmer and avid gardener Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, as everyone shares the mutant squashes that are appearing in their compost piles and the parts of the yard where they had grown pumpkins the year before. What are these things? They are, of course, those lazy, promiscuous, hybrid, prolific squash and pumpkins that made the Puritans so uncomfortable back in episode 14. But to make a pure custard pudding with no or a limited amount of stabilizing breadcrumbs, stirred over a fire and then baked in a brick oven, that showed you had time to learn or money to hire or buy a skilled cook. And if you had one of these new indoor Count Rumford fireplaces and ovens, it meant you had the coin to install spiffy, improved cooking equipment, as well as access to plenty of nice hardwood firewood that had been skillfully dried and meticulously cut to nice, convenient sizes. There is a definite difference in the type of puddings Amelia Simmons writes about in her American Cookery versus those in something like John Knott's Cook's and Confectioner's Dictionary. Amelia Simmons, while for the type of people who could read, so overall better off, was still aimed at what would be termed plain cooking. There were no subtleties in there, no saffron and no candied nuts. It was for a home cook. Lots of pumpkin and breadcrumb thickened puddings. John Knott's, on the other hand, published in England, was for a professional cook who owned a confectioner's shop or worked in a grand house. It included instructions on clarifying sugar syrup, clear jellies, blancmanges, and pralines, or as we'd say, pralines or pralines. Anyway, not going to get into that one either. So as the end of the colonial period approached, puddings came to mean only something sweet. Cream churned to butter became cake. Cream cooked with eggs and pumpkin or sweet potatoes or breadcrumbs and different tasty and or expensive flavors became puddings. But just as cream cheese was invented to deal with cream surplus, other innovations were afoot. I had mentioned that in Europe, ice in summer was for Roman oligarchs ordering oysters from Britannia, or Alexander the Great to chill his decadent unwatered wine, or for cultured court poets in Al-Andalus to cool their throats with a slushy pomegranate sherbet. Ice-cooled stuff was for people with money who regularly encountered things encrusted with gold. But in the North American British colonies, a pretty average, successful, large family or industrious community could organize and stock an ice house. It was no longer only the very, very, extremely, very wealthy. Sure, they had ice houses too, but so did some pretty normalish people now. Several things. Above and beyond riverfront access and enough ground to dig an ice cellar contributed to this. A big one was the lack of the corvée or similar tax-type labor obligations, or the forced labor much of the peasantry of Europe had been required to do. The corvée was the upkeep labor peasants had to do at the landowners or the crown's whim or schedule. Above and beyond the field labor they owed and the labor they did on the land they had to pay the landowner for and then feed their family. The extra labor was often used to do things like fix and maintain roads, drainages, locks and rivers or bridges, clear fallen trees, clear new land for farming, erect walls, repair manor buildings or cellars, and so on. A second big reason for the rise of the ice house was land ownership. Period. By the time of the founding of the New World colonies, much of Western Europe was claimed, owned, and cut up as much as it was going to get. And if you were not of the land-owning class, you never were going to be. As hard as you might ever toil, however big your ideas were, you'd never own land, and so there was a limited amount of improvement you'd ever put into a plot of land you could be ejected from at a whim. But in the colonies, there was a lot of land people were simply plopping themselves down on and saying, "Mine." There was no one to tell them not to. Well, okay, if the Native Americans who had previously used the land showed up one day, you could always call the neighbors and the local garrison to help you chase them off. After all, you were a nice, stable, God-fearing European who had built a house and fences and had a pig or cows or at least a goat, and the people claiming right of passage or hunting or fishing were savages. So anyway, land ownership led to people feeling like it was worth the energy to build one of these ice houses, a sure sign of civilization and fanciness. Not to mention all the metal tools that were now available to make an ice house, and as I mentioned last episode, all sorts of other outbuildings possible. Picks, shovels, hammers, stone chisels, the nails, door hinges, and so on. And then there were the saws. Ice sawing had been a bit of a specialty occupation in Nordic countries for a while. We all saw Frozen, or at least some of us saw some of it. But in the New World, where things like new plowshares, ship hardware, axe blades, and new and improved water mill-powered saw blades were being developed, people were experimenting with new tools to harvest ice as well. And speaking of saw blades and sawmills, people were learning that sawdust wasn't just a waste product that clogged up fish streams. It was good for ice insulation as well. So people were able to keep cream and other stuff cool in their ice houses. And they were able to play with that double basin trick, small bowl on the inside, ice or an ice slush surrounding it on the outside, held by a much larger one. Which is where we start to get very, very close to ice cream. By the end of the 17th century, elaborate feasts of frozen trompe-l'oeil food, iced creams painted to look like hams or fish or whole fruits were being presented to European royalty surrounded by elaborately carved ice sculptures, especially in Italy. This was the high point of Italian kingdoms sprawling all over Europe, and so having the wealth of many duchies and princedoms and estates to draw on. For example, the kingdom of Sicily was administered by the crown of Aragon, part of modern Spain, which also oversaw Athens, Majorca, Provence, Naples, and Sardinia. There was a concentration of power, and they had lots of money to do things like make ice cream and then make the ice cream look like other things. But in the New World, where people were just sorting out building fences and houses with a second story, the fancy dessert scene was a little behind. There, the height of fanciness was using the double cream I talked about last week. It could be whipped up into peaks and then drained and rested on ice to make little cream mounds they called snows, which could be used to top cakes or hide sugared fruits. In summer, chilled custard sauces were served over strawberries or other seasonal fruits. A cream and egg yolk mixture, sweetened with sugar and flavored with rosewater and possibly musk or saffron, could be cooked over a small fire until it coated the back of a wooden spoon. Then it would be stirred while cooling in a small metal basin resting in an ice slush inside a larger basin. The thickened and cooled sauce would be poured over the fruits and maybe some cake, and enjoyed in the sweltering evening heat. Again, in the fanciest capitals of Europe, the secret of exothermic interaction of salt and ice and water had been discovered, recognized, and then kept very, very secret. But in the rough and tumble colonies, such fripperies were not making it out to the frontiers. Sure, we had custard and ironworks, but the chemistry of food tricks was a bit behind. And yes, I am working on a bonus episode of Ice Science to explain all of this. It'll be out soon. So the julep, sharbat, sherbet, shrub-type drink makes its appearance. The American version will evolve into those drinks that are punch bowls, sporting giant ice cubes with fruit frozen inside, bobbling along in mixtures of fruit punch plus 7-Up, or rum concoctions with a block of lime sherbet floating in it. But in the 18th century, flavored, syrupy concoctions, again cooled in the double basin setup, would be stirred with rum or imported brandy or Madeira wine or maybe a particularly tasty home-brewed and then fortified orange wine. The frosty concoction would be alternately sipped and then pressed against foreheads and the back of necks at the peak of the Virginia summer heat. So all that was holding ice cream back from appearing in the North American colonies was a little chemistry and some better stoves. After the Revolutionary War, the Rumford-style improved ovens start to appear more widely. The 1789 French Revolution sends French cooks to the New World to wash up in the kitchens of the relatively nouveau riche planters and shipbuilders and cod traders and cattle barons and factors of the New World. These refugee cooks bring with them designs of new stoves, which use the more controllable fuel of charcoal and soon coal, which will make it much easier to cook things like custards that don't need to use breadcrumbs for thickening. The salt situation shifts, the secret alchemy of water colder than ice spreads, and finally, ice cream will really arrive in the opening of the 19th century, because the colonies already had everything else they needed to make it happen. We are on the verge of so many things that are about to be American. The kitchen traditions of the colonies are peeling away from the way things are done. One area is the development of chemical yeast, or non-yeast leavening. And this is what will contribute to what is about to be a whole bunch of extremely confusing conversations about biscuits. And it largely happens because the colonists are sampling what many of the English would call that foreign muck. And because they have way more wood to burn. So join me next week when we explore more in the entertainingly jumbled world of 18th century New World baking terminology. I'm going to stand firm on the contention that there is nothing called a cracker yet. But beyond that, the nothings and nevers are dangerous positions to stake out. Join me and find out just exactly what is called a biscuit. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com and on Twitter or Insta at @THOAFood. A few words to review this podcast really do help spread the word to the food and history curious alike. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio @THOA Food and in the show description.